Good evening, everyone. I'm Ashley. I'm the Harmony Facilitator for the Calgary congregation. I apologize. There's lots of legs running around on a tile floor, so I'm sure you can hear that. And Parker and Caitlin are with me this evening as well. I'm so sorry. That's a weird cat. So tonight we're going to pick up where the congregation left off, discussing the importance of labels, kind of going into some of the more specific terms, but really focusing on why labels are important, why really naming identity is important, and clarifying that. For this whole process. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it on over to Parker. We're going to be watching a video produced by Reconciling Works, which they are the people that helped compile the toolkit that we've been working through. And this video is called Why Do You Need a Label for Everything? And it's different folks sharing their testimonies really about the importance of these labels, which we will continue to dive into after the video. So Parker, feel free to get us started.
This LGBTQ acronym that people throw around, it can be really confusing.
It's a group, and however the group chooses to identify, I think the most important thing is that that choice is respected by people outside of the group.
The labels are an attempt to help everyone feel like that they're seen, that they're welcomed, that we all have an actual place.
I think that by recognizing the particularity of my transness helps me to connect with other people with my specific struggle or joys or journey, but also recognizing that I'm a part of a larger queer community helps us to share common stories about coming out and the struggles in the workplace or the joys that we have in being a beautiful, diverse creation.
There's to be a name to something for it to be recognized, and you can stand up and be counted amongst your fellow people in that group.
We also have to consider the intersections of race and class and religion, nationality, and all these other different identity factors that go into how people express themselves within these different categories.
Amongst friends, I always like to help people in terms of translating something that doesn't make sense for a group that you're not a part of. I think that people in the United States are more familiar with Black and white relations, so if you don't know why LGBTQIA feel like they need to label themselves, then think about the way that Black people in the United States have quote-unquote labeled themselves. We have had many names said to us that we didn't necessarily accept, but once we were able to have a voice for ourselves, we asked. So African American became the term, and it changes. It's okay for things to change.
Even those of us that would identify as being a part of the LGBTQIA community, we often sometimes don't understand its fullness. And it's only through being in a relationship with one another that I think we're able to move towards that space where we're able to see, oh, this is why it's important to have a defined label or a defined expression that allows us to move in a way that gives us voice and presence in our society.
We have a big, beautiful God who has created all of this diversity. What better way to worship that God but to celebrate that diversity and to look for it?
Thank you for sharing that video, Parker. I think that I hadn't seen this video before, but I think it does a really great job of sort of starting the conversation out here about why it's important to have so many labels. And I think it's an important aspect of becoming not only a welcoming congregation, but a welcoming and affirming congregation, is to fully embrace these terms and to have a positive attitude, and to be able to ask questions and feel comfortable in asking questions and waiting for the response when you receive them from people. So I really like that video. I also love that it's put on by another faith community. So it's rooted in sort of a faith setting. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and we're going to be going through pages 44 and 45 of our toolkit here. And they are numbered and labeled in your very beautiful Harmony toolkit that you have there. So on pages 42 and 43 is kind of a primer on some of these concepts, and talks a little bit about the history of how we've come to understand the gender spectrum, the sexual orientation spectrum, and the gender identity spectrum as well. So if you want some more information, you can certainly access that. So this first paragraph here, we really went through it by just looking at the video there. In the welcoming journey, the goal is to deepen and expand a faith community's ability to welcome people of all sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. However, to this day, the dominant story LGBTQIA2S+ people hear from communities of faith is God does not love them just as they are. The hope for a faith community is to be able to respond with hospitality and true welcome to people who hold a diversity of identities, particularly differences in gender identity and or gender expression. So that's our goal. So the SOGI scale is something that they talk about throughout this. It's the sexual orientation, gender identity expression spectrum. I probably won't use that because I like to talk about them individually. So sex, speaking from a biological standpoint, not talking about sexual intercourse, that's another course that you can take at a different time. So your biological sex is determined at birth, either by your chromosomes, your XX or XY chromosomes, your external genitalia, so penis or vulva, and reproductive organs, be they internal or external. Also hormones come into this. So some people with ambiguous or other biological issues might have maybe what is referred to as intersexed. So it used to be hermaphrodite was an old term that was used for it, and ambiguous genitalia is something that you might hear. That's a bit more of a modern term, but even in the medical community, we're trying to move more towards an intersex perspective. So in terms of sexual identity, biological sexual identity, there really is only female, male, and anything in between is really intersex. There might be more female expression, more male expression, but this is kind of the nuts and bolts of it. Doug had a really good way of describing it, of your sex being your hardware and your gender identity and gender expression being the software, if you were referring to a computer. So you can think about that analogy as we go forward, if that's helpful. So gender identity. This refers to a person's innate, deeply felt physiological identification as a woman, man, or another gender, which may or may not coincide with the biological sex they were given at birth. So gender identity is different from gender, which is usually something that we would use to say woman, man, still kind of one side or the other. So gender identity is specifically what an individual feels about themselves. And this spectrum is getting bigger and bigger all of the time as it becomes more, I don't want to say acceptable in society, as it becomes more mainstream in society. There's more exploration, there's more recognition of different identities. So on the one side, you have woman, or feminine, and then on the other side you have masculine. And so even we had some congregation members talk about how when they were younger, maybe they were tomboys or something like that. And so at different parts of your life, you might identify on different parts of the spectrum. but that doesn't necessarily change your biological sex. It's still what you feel inside, masculine, feminine, somewhere in between. In different settings, you might feel a little bit different or feel neither of them, which would put you in the middle in something called non-binary, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But so woman, man, genderqueer is kind of in the middle. And then gender expression is the external characteristics and behaviors that people exhibit to express how they identify. And different people have different levels of expression anyways. There are some females, so biologically female, who identify as women, who have a very, very strong feminine gender expression. You know, typically the things you would think of is they wear lots of pink, they wear lots of sparkles, they wear lots of ribbons and high heels and makeup, and they do their hair and things like that. And on the opposite side, you have biologically male people who identify as masculine, who are expressing hypermasculine. I don't know, lift weights, drive motorcycles, fix trucks, whatever it is that manly men do. So even people who are not on this spectrum of being atypical, or not atypical, but I made this statement when we did this as a congregation. Whenever I say abnormal or atypical, I'm not referring to anything being wrong. What I'm saying is that it's different from the norm being that we live in a society where, at least as well as we know, most people have a gender identity that aligns with their biological sex. And the way that they express that aligns with those other two. So what I'm speaking about is the people who kind of fall outside of that, who are maybe feeling a different gender identity than what they were assigned at birth. And then a gender expression that, again, is maybe in contrast to what they were biologically assigned at birth. So this can be, this scale is, again, masculine or feminine. So things like dressing, grooming, your mannerisms, speech patterns, social interactions, and the norms vary culturally. Men and women express themselves different here in Canada than they would in, say, India, or even Italy, or Australia, even. I think of different cultures like that, and in some cultures they even have words built into their languages that account for these individuals. In university, I took a sexual psychology class, and we learned about a Samoan culture in the Pacific Islands, where they have men and they have women, and then they have fa'afafines, which are hyperfeminine males, and they have fa'afatamas, which are hypermasculine females. And they, in that culture, they do not deny, the fa'afafines do not deny that they are biologically men, but it is accepted that they present feminine, and they have a very specific role in society. They're basically the doting caregivers for the other people in the society who have young children or responsibilities and things like that. So they often are successful business people. They own small businesses, and they help support the rest of the community because they don't have their own children, or maybe even their own partner. So that's a really interesting example of how because it's not a thing in our society, doesn't mean that it's not a thing in the rest of the world, and it's not necessarily a new concept either. And so just a quick review. So your biological identity is up here. You've got your male, your female, your intersex is somewhere in between. Underneath that, you have your gender identity. So how you feel inside, which can be woman, man, somewhere in the middle, gender queer. And again, the gender identity depending on who you are, depending on where you are, depending on where you're at with your journey of your gender identity and expression, just because you feel like your gender identity might be more masculine, that might not mean that you are ready to express it yet. So underneath your gender identity, then comes your gender expression. So what you're putting out to the world. And again, in different settings, this might be different, because certainly not all women are going to show up to, let's say, a work camp out at Hills of Peace in their ball gowns with their hair done and makeup and all of that. We're gonna do different things for different circumstances. Around certain friends, you might feel, you know, ultra flirty, femme, whatever. Among other friends, you might not feel that way. And that's a normal thing in the human experience anyways. And what we're talking about here is more of an ongoing day-to-day sort of identification and experience and expression of that. Is there anything, Ashley and Parker, that you would like to toss in before we go forward?
I was just going to add, because you added this last time and you did such a wonderful job. You had mentioned, and you had just mentioned it actually without really saying it, but that expression and presenting yourself are synonymous ways that you can explain, outwardly express, your gender expression. So you had said something about how they present. And so I just wanted to kind of circle back to that can be used interchangeably with gender expression or how you present yourself. So just circling back to a point that you brought up last time, I'm not taking credit for that. So, but no, I think that was a wonderful explanation.
Yeah, and totally agree. Great review, Miss Nurse Caitlin. And I wanted to just kind of, if you scroll up just a bit, to see sex, gender identity, and gender expression together. The first two can be done in private. I mean, as far as like understanding what's going on, you can't see someone's genitalia just walking down the street. You can't see how someone feels about themselves just walking down the street. You have to have policies, legal protections, safe spaces before people will really even have the courage to feel that they can truly express who they are. So the more that we seek that out and express our welcome and affirming status, the more likely you might see more gender expressions that you have never seen before. And that doesn't mean, wow, this is a new thing. That means, wow, we've created a safe space. So for example, when I go to more queer affirming spaces in Calgary or anywhere when I'm traveling, like gay bars or drag shows or anything like that, people feel very comfortable sharing who they are with that group of people. Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, I doubt that's what they wear to work. And that just depends on who they are and what's going on in their lives. Some people are truly transitioning or expressing who they are on a permanent basis, and that's one thing. But when someone's really kind of just experimenting or trying to figure out where they feel most comfortable, you know, they know what they want to gravitate to. But just like you, we were all conditioned with pink blanket, blue blanket, and there were expectations when you were brought home. And so we're all very aware of those things, and we all have to push a little harder to get into, okay, I know this isn't what I'm technically supposed to be doing according to Western society, but I feel better over here. So again, if we can create these spaces, I just want to forewarn, caution, not really that second one, just say, as we welcome it, you will see more. And I think that's a great testament to us putting ourselves, or I guess aligning ourselves in the way that we really see ourselves going. Sorry, that was a mouthful, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say, hopefully.
Yeah, definitely. Great additions to the conversation, you guys. And I think, Parker, you bring up a great point. I think that everybody that's going to be listening to this recording has some experience with camps within Community of Christ, or some sort of camping experience, or a place that they have felt like they can truly express themselves, be themselves, really explore who they are as a person. And so in those types of spaces, the queer community often finds those spaces in places that are not religious, because of the contentions that can be held in those spaces. So those other spaces become gay bars or pride parades or kind of like private spaces that they know are already safe. And so that's our goal, is to create another space like that where people feel like they can be the truest expression of themselves and to be able to be who they feel they're meant to be. And Ashley, thanks for bringing up that point about how someone is presenting. That's a term that you'll kind of hear in amongst the genderqueer community, is some people present more masculine, some people present more feminine. And we will get into transgender individuals in a few minutes here, but especially when you're talking about transgender individuals, there historically has been a lot of pressure for someone who has made the decision to become transgender and to transition, like take hormones or to have surgeries or change the way that they're dressing, things like that, that they then will present as the gender that they are transitioning to, and that they will pass as that gender. So male transitioning to female, historically, the pressure would be there for that man to become hyper feminine and to in public pass as a woman. Whereas now, again, as the gender spectrum becomes more understood, becomes more accepted, we are recognizing that there's a whole bunch of in between. And so there is space for more feminine women who have transitioned to become men, but they retain some of their feminine traits because they're still a more feminine person, but their gender identity is still masculine. And that's who they truly feel that they want to be. We had a great question last week about where drag queens and drag kings fit into this. And the people dressed up in all kinds of costumes that you might see at pride parades or gay bars and things like that. And Parker did a really great job of kind of delineating between the two, that drag and what you see at pride parades and gay bars and things like that is performative. It's theatrical in a way. And some of those people do identify as a gender that might not align with their biology, in drag as well as out of drag. But when you see someone in drag, they are purposefully, most of the time, purposefully trying to showcase one gender or the other. And so that fits more into a theater, costumey type of space. And so you wouldn't necessarily look at someone who is a drag queen, which has traditionally been a biological male, dressing up to look like a female or a hyper feminine version of what women look like. You wouldn't automatically assume that that person is transgender. They might still fully identify in their everyday life as masculine or as a man, but they like to do drag, just like some people like to do Shakespeare, or some people like to do salsa dancing or something like that. It's not something that you do all the time. You dress up specifically for that performance that you're doing. So in the past, maybe these people would have been referred to as cross-dressers. Now the terms are more drag queen for more masculine individuals performing as more feminine, or drag kings for more feminine presenting individuals performing as more masculine. And then in the middle, there's all kinds of different expressions because the art form of drag is just exploding. But that was an interesting little discussion that we had as well. So we've talked about biological sex, we've talked about gender identity and gender expression. So all of these things are related only to your biological sex and your gender. It is completely separate from your sexual orientation. So if possible, try and like partition out that part of gender right now, and we're just going to talk about sexual orientation, which is where a lot of this conversation has officially started within Community of Christ is within sexual orientation, not necessarily the gender sphere. They go hand in hand in a lot of ways because there are many individuals who identify with more than one letter of the acronym of LGBTQIA2S+. But they are separate things. So sexual orientation is the term used to describe which genders, so again, not biology, which genders someone is physically and or emotionally attracted to. So this is an emotional connection, this is a physical connection attracted to them. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, queer, and straight are all examples of sexual orientations. A person's sexual orientation is distinct from a person's sex, gender identity, and gender expression, as we just talked about. So on one side of this, as you can see in front of you, you have one side attracted to men, one side attracted to women, and in the middle, no holds barred in there. On the next page that we're going to go to, we're going to talk a little bit more about the other sexual orientations. So if some of these words are new to you, not to worry. But I love this graphic here that it just has attracted to men on one side, attracted to women on the other side, and it doesn't even really touch on the heterosexual versus homosexual. It just goes based off of who you're attracted to. And an important piece to this, and I think that this has a lot of historical and like societal background to it, but it's important to emphasize that regardless of what gender you're attracted to, you're not attracted to everyone in that gender. Certainly among the gay community, there is a lot of fear from straight men who would be attracted to women, that if a gay man were to come around them, like, then, oh my gosh, is he going to hit on me? Like, is he going to turn me gay? Like all of those things that we know are not true, but still persist in society, which is unfortunate. I, as a woman who is attracted to men, am not attracted to all men. I would not walk into a place and look at every single man in that room and think, yes, every single one of these I would like to be my life partner. So that's something important to keep in mind, not just because a woman who is attracted to other women enters our space, or a man who is attracted to other men, or even someone who identifies as bisexual or pansexual, who you could umbrella kind of say, oh, well, they're attracted to everyone. That doesn't mean that they're looking to have a sexual or emotional connection with every single person on the planet, if that makes sense. Again, you guys jump in anytime.
Yeah, I was
No,
just, oh, sorry,
Go
Ashley. I was just going to say, I think it's interesting, the comment you made about straight men feeling uncomfortable around gay men for that reason. A lot of it boils down to in our masculine culture, because on top of all of what we're talking about, we do exist within a culture. And in our culture, it tends to be quite masculine, and masculine characteristics have historically been really lifted up as being kind of like the best. And so that's why feminine men get shamed, and that's why masculine men kind of just are kind of put up on a pedestal. But within that, straight men tend to not be used to being objectified. And I think women have to deal with this all the time. All my women friends who will share with me how awful it is to go to any sort of bar or club environment because you just get touched inappropriately. They call you things, they catcall you, like they think that they can say those things to you because they're men. And this is not a blanket statement to say that all men are this way, but there is an acceptability within our culture that that is something that is just apparently going to happen in certain places. For straight men, going to a gay bar can be a very interesting experience because they're like, what the heck? Like, I am not used to this. And I think it's actually a really positive thing to kind of have more awareness on, to think, oh, is this what I'm doing to the gender that I'm attracted to? Like, am I kind of objectifying them to the point where they're uncomfortable because I shouldn't be doing that? Or how is my language being perceived whenever I'm saying something? Do they think I'm flirting with them? all those types of things. So that's a larger umbrella conversation for the type of culture that we exist within. But I think it's worth mentioning, as Caitlin said earlier, like just because I'm attracted to men doesn't mean I'm attracted to every man I ever encounter.
Well, and I was just gonna say, I'm sorry, I have a dog in my lap. I was just gonna kind of follow up on that statement, Parker, and say, this isn't a blanket statement for everyone, but in my experience, anytime I have been to a gay club or something like that, a gay bar, I feel like the space that has been created is so welcoming and inclusive. I'm like, this is the best. Like I feel safe here, and I feel I don't know, it's just very different. And maybe that is because of the objectification that I faced in other places. But again, that's something for another time. But that is a really good point to bring up. The second thing I was going to say was, Caitlin was talking about the, I'm going to lose my train of thought here. The importance of, people not necessarily. So talking is so hard sometimes. She was saying that people who are gay don't necessarily, men who are gay don't necessarily like all men. I think that's a very important point to bring up. But also, as we go through this welcoming and affirming program, and create this sacred space within your congregation, I think that these are things to take out with you into the world. So when you hear people making those statements of, oh, that guy's going to make me gay, or that guy's going to hit on me, I think it's really important to take these things that we've learned, these tools that we've learned, and apply them to real life and say, well, actually, don't flatter yourself too much, and kind of just use it to create sacred space everywhere you go, and to make the world a better place. But yeah, that's what I thought of. So that's all I have for now.
That's a good point too. And I forgot one thing else I was going to mention. I read a book all about the history of the gay movement, now known as the queer movement, within the United States. And the legal classification for someone who would have been caught in the act of having same-sex relations was sexual deviant. And so there became this whole public idea that people who were queer were sexual deviants, which kind of comes to this point of being predatory, which is also another kind of reinforces this idea that, gay men or queer folks are looking to be inappropriate, or like make you uncomfortable. And that's not at all the case. It's just a holdover, I think, from some of those, which it's not even been that long ago. This is like 60s, 70s. There were entire police units who their job was to hover in men's washrooms over the urinal areas to make sure no one touched each other inappropriately, looked at each other inappropriately. And if they did, their entire lives were over. They would lose their jobs. They would have that on their record that they were sexual deviants. Like, there is just a whole lot there. And I would love to do a book club about that book, by the way. Anyway, I'm going to let Caitlin keep going.
No, this is all really great discussion, and there's so much out there. Like, one of the areas that I'm really interested in, like periods of history, was the HIV/AIDS crisis, and that has also, there was so much momentum in the queer movement, in the queer rights movement, and then unfortunately HIV/AIDS came in and really undid decades and decades of work, because all of a sudden these men primarily were getting sick and dying, and the only thing that they could put together was that they were gay. Originally HIV, before they isolated the virus and actually gave it a name, the associated illness was called gay-related immune deficiency, which I think is crazy. By 2021 standards, you couldn't even classify an illness that way. It just wouldn't happen. But back in the 80s, which again is not that long ago, it did. But anyways, there's so much, and this is what's great about having the discussion about it, and bringing context to it. Of there is decades and decades of work that has been done, that has been going into this. And I think this is a great point to pause before we get to the next page here, because one thing that came up in our meeting a couple of weeks ago on the 3rd, which is part of why we're having such an intentional discussion about this now, is that a lot of people don't like labels, and a lot of people find labels to be limiting. And the focus that the queer community, and as it was put in the Clunky Questions video, in the Black community as well, is it's the importance of the people within that group who are choosing the labels. There's a difference between someone taking a sticker and putting it on your forehead with a label. That's different than putting a t-shirt on with a label that you choose. So that's really what we're trying to build here, is an awareness of the intentionality of these labels, and that there is a reason why they exist, and there's a reason why, for people that these labels matter a lot to, that they will make them known to you if they're in a safe space. We'll talk about pronouns in a little bit, but a lot of people express a lot of anxiety about pronouns and how do I know? We're not asking anybody to be a private investigator. We're not asking anyone to read people's minds. It's just that if the information is offered, if I introduce myself as, hi, my name is Caitlin, my pronouns are she, her, all we're asking is that you register that information because I offered that information, and so therefore it's important to me. The example that I brought up is, now that I'm divorced and I've gone back to my maiden name, there are lots of people who have only known me as Caitlin Destaire. And so then when they'll ask me like, oh, is your last name Destaire? It's now Ball, like, did you get married? And I just kind of joke like, no, I got unmarried. And, we all laugh about it. It's awkward for a second and then it's fine. It's all about, we're all figuring it out as we go. And what we're trying to do here is to give you tools to be able to have those conversations and to have the confidence that if you're unsure, to just ask. It's not offensive to ask someone their pronouns if you're unsure. And the pronouns that they give you are going to be the ones that they're asking you to accept. They're not asking you to read into it. There could be someone who is standing in front of you, looks very masculine to you, but if they introduce themselves as she, her, or they, them, what they're asking you is to ignore what your eyeballs are seeing and to listen to what they're saying and what they're asking of you. So that's just an important point as we go forward.
Yeah, I was just also going to add, it's all about reclaiming power in a situation. And power that is due, not an overreach of power. I truly believe it's power that is due to every individual. Just because I look at someone and my eyeballs see what I perceive to be as masculine or feminine, and Caitlin already talked about how that's different across different cultures as well. Who am I to be able to prescribe those words that mean male or female, he, him, to those people? Or sorry, he, her, he, him, or she, her. Why would I have the power in that situation to prescribe those instead of waiting for them to tell me? And so it's about kind of taking that identity back and saying, well, you're the person that I'm communicating with. Like, you take the lead here. I want you to tell me. And it's not my place to even use my eyeballs to prescribe pronouns in the first place. We've just kind of gotten into that habit, and all languages are different. We talked a bit about that on our last call as well. But I would say, I had one more point to this, was to say, pronouns, asking questions.
Power differential.
I mean, there certainly is I was just going to say, so Caitlin's example was great about, we're not asking you to do something that you're terribly uncomfortable with. And this community, the queer community, looks for subtle cues from people like you to tell them that they're safe, to reaffirm that they made the right decision, to be open about who they are with you. And so sometimes you'll hear me on church activities introducing myself as my name is Parker Johnson and I use he, him pronouns. Well, 99% of those people know that I am Parker Johnson and that I use he, him pronouns. But in certain situations, I will intentionally do it to signal that I am taking that off, that expectation or that awkwardness out of, I don't want them to be the only ones giving their pronouns. If I normalize it, it makes it a lot easier for them to feel safe enough to give them. So it was a yes and caveat, I guess, to Caitlin's comment earlier, which was totally accurate. 99% of the time, you're not going to be walking around in the world and saying, hi, my name is Jane Doe and I use he, she, her pronouns. You just have to read the room and kind of know, is this okay? Is this not? And in certain public settings, if we have guests, like in church world, I'm trying to just train myself to say it every time, because that way, when I do introduce myself, it just comes out, because I'm trying to be welcoming and set that standard and that tone for welcome. So.
Well, and I was just going to say, Caitlin had mentioned that you're not going to get it right every single time. We're all going to make mistakes just because you're learning new vocabulary. You're trying to understand these things, and you're really putting in the work to better yourself, as an ally, but also to create that welcoming and affirming space in the congregation. But even though, like Parker was saying, you want to read the room, I've personally tried to just get into that mindset of, my name is Ashley Sabria, my pronouns are she, her. And at my job, which really doesn't feel like a comfortable space to do that, I work for the government, I listed my pronouns, right, like I do here on my Zoom, just because that's how it always logs me in for one of our work calls. And someone came up to me afterwards that I've never spoken to about this topic. And they said, I really appreciated that you had your pronouns on the call today. And that was all they said. But just kind of, taking that step to put that on there, even though I didn't mean to, meant something to them, to where, later on we continued having these kinds of conversations. So I think it's just important to just to kind of get into that mindset of trying to be more inclusive and trying to get into the habit of using pronouns just whenever you do feel like it's a comfortable situation or in a situation that's acceptable, or you just forget on your Zoom, and then that works too.
Yeah, and my friends who work as nurses in Ontario, everyone signs their charting with their pronouns. Like, that's in Ontario. That's in this country. And as you were both talking, I just kept thinking about, like, the original Christian symbol was drawing the fish in the sand. And so if someone knew what you were talking about, it was very meaningful for them. If they knew what that symbol meant, that meant that they were safe, that meant that they could be open, that meant that they knew what you were talking about. And so these are all subtle ways that you can sort of draw that fish in the sand and tell people, you're safe here. I'm speaking your language, like, are you in the club? Because, like, we're in the club and it's okay. So just bringing it all back. Love all the symbols and metaphors. So jumping back in, so additional terms to know. So I really also like the way that this is broken down on these 2 pages, is that it talks about what you're going to encounter most frequently and what we're all most comfortable with, the terms that we have heard the most often, that are most common in our society. And then it goes into these additional terms to know. And so bisexual, so bi meaning two, is an identity term that describes the sexual orientation of someone who is physically or emotionally attracted to people of more than one gender. So it still is on that spectrum of attracted to men, attracted to women, anywhere in between. So basically a pick two on that scale. And then pansexual, so pan meaning all or inclusive, encompassing, is a sexual identity term, or a sexual orientation term, describing physical or emotional attraction to people of any gender identity. So Marilyn Smith brought up the great example from Schitt's Creek, if anybody has watched that, where David is talking about it and he says, well, I care more about the wine than the label, It's not about the label, it's about the wine, essentially. And that's just such a great way to look at it, is that they are looking at each individual and assessing the whole individual, and not sort of limiting themselves based on how they present or how they express their gender or what their biological sex is. So again, going back to our point earlier, just because you are attracted to more than one gender, or you are attracted regardless of gender, does not mean that you are attracted to every individual that fits on that criteria. I don't think could be a human being on this earth that is physically or emotionally attracted to every single other human being on the planet. We all have things that we're compatible and not compatible with. So that's just not not a concern that I think any of us really need to entertain. And as Ashley said, we don't need to all flatter ourselves. I mean, it would be nice if everyone in the world was attracted to us, but that's just not real life. So again, bisexual and pansexual, the word sexual in there gives you a good hint that that's talking again about sexual identity, again, separate from gender identity. Sorry, I said sexual identity, I meant sexual orientation. So transgender, so going back to our conversation about language and about how for us it can feel very foreign to use certain language. Like there's a lot of discussion about they them pronouns and how does that work with the plural. Well, if you were talking about someone's ball that was left in a field, you wouldn't say someone left their ball here, he or she must be really missing it. You would say they must be really missing it, because you don't know. And we'll get back to pronouns, but just getting back into the language. So English rooted in Latin, most of our medical terms are rooted in Latin or Greek. So trans is the Latin word for cross. So someone who is transgender has crossed from the gender that they were assigned at birth, and they have crossed to a different gender identity. So this is just a great sentence in this toolkit. As a way of practicing hospitable curiosity, it is important to remember a transgendered person's body belongs to them, and that people do not have the right to ask if or how they are seeking any medical treatments. So this is where gender identity and gender expression come back into it, because someone may be biologically female, may have a gender identity of male, may choose to identify as transgender, but still may only end up here on the gender expression spectrum, somewhere in between. It is up to the individual how much they want to transition, if they want to transition. And again, going back to those gender expressions, it might just be changing the way you walk and the way you talk. It might start with wearing makeup or stopping to wear makeup, or cutting your hair or letting it grow, to hormones and multiple surgeries, multiple medical treatments and things like that. And whatever transition journey that person is on is their business. Of course, there's human curiosity, but it's just something that unless that information is shared with you, which may be more likely to happen as we create a more welcoming and affirming space for these individuals, it may be something that comes up, but it's not something like I wouldn't ask Parker about what medical procedures have you had in your life related to being a boy. And I wouldn't ask Ashley, what surgeries have you had in your life related to being a girl? You know, and it's shocking how much transgendered individuals are probed and asked and inquired about their medical history, even when it's not relevant, even by other medical professionals. So this isn't just something that happens in just, you know, common social scenarios. It's something that goes all the way up in our society. And it's just something that, would I ask someone else's question. Like, I'm curious, but it's not really my business. So again, if that information is offered to you, the best way that you can react is to be supportive and say like, wow, that must have been a huge journey for you. Or, you know, and Parker made an important point about this. As someone is transitioning, if you're aware that they're transitioning, to celebrate those milestones. When a female transitions to be more masculine, that individual might start taking hormones, they might grow facial hair, you know, the distribution of their weight might start to change and things like that. And so if you are included in their journey, then celebrate those things. Like, oh my gosh, look at how your beard's coming in, or things like that. It's like a second puberty, and some people will be more open about it than others. And so just kind of taking people's cues and helping to celebrate those little milestones and things like that. So this graphic down here is a really great sort of explanation of cisgender and transgender. And again, this diagonal line here for the transgender is going all the way across the spectrum, but that might not necessarily be as far as their gender expression goes. I love that over here, it has gender identity, and the expression may be anywhere along that.
Caitlin, I was just going to ask, you know, you were talking about not,
so then
oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, we can hear you, Ashley. Caitlin
Okay,
just kind of broke up for a second.
Okay. Caitlin was talking about the importance of, you know, not asking, like thinking about whether or not you should be asking folks questions, you know, based on, you know, what they're sharing with you and whether or not that's appropriate. One thing I always kind of come back to in my own mind when I have a question that maybe I think, well, I probably shouldn't ask someone that. I sit there and I think to myself, well, Google is free. You know, if I have this question, maybe somebody on the internet already had this question, or maybe someone already felt comfortable enough to openly share that with folks who are curious. So, you know, if you feel uncomfortable, maybe asking the question, whether it's about the process or kind of what people are thinking, you know, obviously one person on the internet isn't going to have the same experience. They're not the voice of the transgender community. Everyone has their own experience, but it may be a good start to kind of dive into some of those questions that you have, again, just so that way you're not making people feel uncomfortable and you're not kind of damaging that relationship if maybe they felt comfortable asking or sharing with you before, and then you ask a question, whether it was meant in a good way or not, they may kind of take a step back and say, well, I don't feel comfortable sharing with them anymore based on that question. So I always think to myself, Google is free. You know, you can do a little bit more research and see what stories people have to share on the internet. So that's just something that always comes to my mind.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Google is great. And there are more and more queer resources, LGBTQIA2S+ resources every day. There are many blogs, there's tons of documentaries and videos and YouTube and all of that out there. There are so many stories that you can read, and everybody's experience is going to be different. But yeah, if you're not sure, Google is a great place to start. I totally agree. So going just below this transgender piece here is the word that you'll hear a lot is cisgender. So Latin word for same. So it means that your biological sex and your gender identity are the same. So same gender. So using the term cisgender is another way to extend hospitality and prevent microaggressions towards transgender people from happening in conversation. So for example, this is a good example. If someone were to introduce you to two women and said, Sarah is a trans woman, but Emily is a real woman, this adds a value and a judgment to one person being more of a woman than another woman. Something you might have seen on social media is trans women are women. And that's the idea there is to place the same value and the same respect of trans women and cisgendered women being the same, because transgendered women, especially of color, are more likely to experience sexual violence, assault, and to be murdered at higher rates than any other category of victims in North America. That is a fact. And so, especially for the trans women community, it is important to affirm and to uphold the worth of these individuals. And sorry, I misquoted what was on social media. So it's trans women are real women, is what you'll usually see on social media. Sorry, I misquoted that. And the other thing, I meant to mention this earlier, but one thing that I think is really important to tie into this piece is we talked a lot about respect and how on our call, a lot of individuals express, I just want to be treated with respect. So like, I'll show other people respect, and it all boils down to respect. And the reason that these labels and these terms and these pronouns and the language that we use are so important is because that's one of the ways that the queer community has spoken very vocally about, is this is how you can show us respect. This is how we know that we're safe. And so we as allies should be listening to what this community is asking for. And this is how we show them respect. How I would ask for respect as like a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman is going to look very different than a person of color who is a transgendered individual who is a lesbian. It's going to look very different. So that's where the respect thread ties in. So changing the introduction to Sarah is a trans woman and Emily is a cis woman helps to remove that judgment. Again, read the room, see what kind of setting you're in. It's not in a normal conversation, and I say that normal again in air quotes, the most often conversations that we're going to have, you're not going to be introducing, hi, this is Ashley. She is a cisgendered woman. This is Parker. He is a cisgendered man. Read the room, see where you're at. And again, if you stumble, there's a couple different ways you can go about it. One is to pause, apologize, correct yourself, move on. One is to just keep going and afterwards correct yourself, do better next time. If you feel that it's necessary, you can pull the person aside, say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, go from there. Queer, this is a word that we talked a lot about and had a lot of rich discussion about in our meeting on November 3rd. And so we wanted to spend a little bit of time with this term. And I really love the way that the toolkit has laid this out. So I'm just going to read it straight from here. So queer is a term that people use for a variety of reasons instead of or in addition to lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Some people choose this term for themselves because their identity is not fully represented by L, G, B, or T. For others, it is a way of identifying with political and cultural differences with those who are straight and cisgender. Queer can sometimes be an umbrella term for the LGBTQIA2S+ community. The term is also used as the academic category related to the LGBTQIA2S+ community and includes queer theology and queer theory. So we've talked a lot about how this historically has been an offensive word, a word that should not be used to refer to the LGBTQIA2S+ community. However, and I'll let Parker speak to this, but it's become a word that is being reclaimed by the community and being taken back. And there's a difference between calling someone a queer and referring to someone as queer or someone identifying themselves as queer. So Parker, I'll let you speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I think kind of this is all connected but different and really important conversation, but we tend to keep saying, as we mentioned earlier with this, something that Caitlin mentioned earlier was about the reclaiming of terms and how intention is the part that is really at play. So if you as a child were in trouble for calling someone a queer on the playground, there's a really good reason for that, because that had intent to harm. you intended to tear someone down, and most likely, if it were in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was likely because you were saying you are less than a man, which also assumes that women are less than men and that they fall within that kind of slippery slope of masculine down to feminine. And that is so toxic, but we just have accepted that was accepted at the time. So that still exists though now. If someone were to say, that queer over there, that's not nice. Like that's not something that you're not trying to use that with the intent to like uplift and celebrate me. If you are referring to respectfully an entire community, like here, I have a lot of great queer theology books behind me, and queer theory has always been a thing since I think the 80s, since it kind of really came out in academia. And so the word queer really is about intentions. And Caitlin, the example I was referencing earlier was the sticker on the forehead versus the t-shirt. I get to choose how I feel I should be referred to, or how I want to refer to myself. Imagine not having a word for how you feel in your body. Like that's really jarring, and not knowing how to like center yourself is difficult as a child. And so I have made a conscious effort, and I feel more comfortable using the word queer because we owe a lot as the LGBTQIA long acronym group to folks who don't exist within the stereotypical Will and Grace flamboyant gay men and lesbian butch women, again stereotypes. And I want to be a part of that culture. I want to be a part of that group that is seeing one another, truly seeing one another, and hearing the other, and understanding how we can uplift and support each other. So all that to say, if you are uncomfortable with how to use queer and you don't really know that you feel confident quite yet, stick with what you do feel confident with. LGBT is still fine. But the thing I will leave you with is this acronym continues to grow, not because we're inventing new ways of being, because we're creating words to describe the ways of being that have been around for thousands of years. And that word can be hard to remember, or that acronym rather, can be hard to remember. I know a lot of people stumble on it. And I intentionally just kind of cut it off earlier because it can feel absurd at times to move through an acronym that long. Acronyms are meant to shorten something, not make it longer. And it could just be difficult for you to remember LGBTQIA2S+, and it would be a lot easier for you likely to just say queer. To shorten it to LGBT, no one's going to be mad at you. It just is something that I've really tried to be intentional about, to speak the entirety of the community labels, if you will, identifiers within that acronym, because I don't want to leave them out. And the plus sign at the end I find hard because I think that it's a great signifier to say we just don't know what we don't know yet. We don't have words for what we haven't yet kind of put our finger on quite yet. But I don't want to label someone as a plus sign or as an asterisk. I want to be more inclusive. And so if I can view the LGBT acronym as a queer umbrella, then I can use that word and include all the people and their experiences along any spectrum within any of those labels that we have, and feel like I'm doing my best to celebrate them. So in sum, use whatever word you feel most comfortable with. I'm not trying to make you say the word queer if you aren't comfortable. However, if you are still sitting there on the other side of the screen and saying, I hate that word, I'm never calling anybody that, and I, as a queer person, am asking you to call me that, just have a moment of check-in with yourself to think, what is it about this situation that I feel like I know better than the person asking me to call them that? And perhaps it's optics, which is a very powerful thing, like social expectations. Those, you don't want to be viewed as someone who is calling me a queer, and the old way you remember it being used. I completely understand that. And I take that as a form of affirmation. You want to treat me with the most respect that you can give me. But sometimes words have limits, and to be gay, I find to be somewhat limiting for me. And so I'm 30. What am I, 34? I think I'm 34. Or am I 33? I don't know. Somebody do the math on that one.
I think you're 33 until March, aren't you?
I think that's right, actually, because Preston just turned 35. Anyway, so I am still experiencing this because I had 19 years in the closet of me just trying to understand what my experience was and who I am. I'm still moving through this and trying to, like, as new words are coined and experiences are brought to me in the form of like sharing and vulnerable narratives, it makes me go, oh, I've had that feeling. I didn't know there was a word for that. And it's really affirming. So don't be afraid of the word. Try to celebrate people and to do it the best you can. So if someone asks you that, to say that word, know that they've put a lot of thought into it. And I guess I'll just end with the fact that some people, and I think it also mentions this in the toolkit, but some people whom you might see as experiencing the world as an LGB or T person might strictly go by queer. And to call them lesbian or gay or bisexual or trans would not fit how they feel about their experience. So by refusing to use that word, you're also not affirming their specific experience or journey. So I understand it's complicated, and I understand that your hearts are in the right place. We've already had this conversation. So this isn't a wrist slap or anything at all like that. It is just to say we are in that gray area of reclaiming this word, and not everyone you're going to come across is going to be like on fire for this word. Some people are going to be like, I'm not a fan of that. But again, read the room. If they call themselves that, follow suit. If they, that's kind of them giving you cues. And if you ever have any questions, feel free to ask Caitlin, myself, or Ashley, and we'd be happy to kind of go through some different case scenarios with you about kind of what might be most appropriate there.
Well, and to follow up with that, I'll just say, Parker talked about how the acronym continues to lengthen itself, and how people stumble over that. It's important to, if the acronym is something that you struggle with, to make sure that you're never being dismissive of it if you can't say LGBTQIA2S+, just like that. So you never want to say something like, oh, that LGBT whatever. If that's something that you kind of catch yourself saying just because you can't remember the acronym, maybe try using the queer community, just because it's not, when you say LGBT whatever, that's kind of a negative way, and you're kind of, again, dismissing what the acronym and what the labels are there for. And so when you're using it that way, it's hurtful and it's not really helping. So you just kind of want to retrain your brain. Even if you're just kidding around or something, it's just important to realize that the words that you speak to people who walk in your congregation are going to have an impact whether you mean them to or not. And then the other thing I was just going to say is Parker was talking about not a lot of people having experience with, maybe some folks haven't heard queer community used in a positive light. Again, at my job, I had an experience where I was just rolling through a conversation. I said, da, 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 the queer community. And the looks that I got at my job, they said, what did you just say? But it was like, oh, let's have this conversation about this. So again, it's just as you continue to practice and think about the words that you say and the conversations that you're having with people, you'll find yourself in these instances, not only in your congregation, but out in the world, where you can, again, use these tools and just kind of, again, make the world a better place. That's what I'm all about tonight, just making the world a better place.
I love that place. That's a great place to be. And I think another example that I've just kind of thought of is with the importance of labels and people recognizing the distinctiveness within those labels is, it's one thing to say Christian. It's a different thing to, especially in a community of Christ context, I think, I don't know this for a fact, but I think that probably every community of Christ person of a certain vintage, myself included in that vintage, has had someone say, well, aren't you a Mormon? And that doesn't that doesn't sit right with us, because we're like, well, no, it's not Mormon, it's kind of the same, but it's not, but it's different, and like we're different because of this and things like that. So that's another way that you can kind of think of it, is queer is an inclusive way to include everyone in the community without putting labels on each individual and either mislabeling or forgetting a label or not being inclusive. You know, so that's just another way you can kind of think about it. And if you only get one thing out of this recording, is that if you're not sure, as long as it's not a personal medical question, it's okay to ask. And or if the information is important, the person will offer it. They may not offer it the first time that you meet, but if that information is important to that person, if like when Parker gets up at the pulpit and he's talking about being a member of the queer community, that is Parker giving you a silver platter with this like sort of get out of jail free card, is I've told you how I want you to see me. This is how I would describe myself. And the other great thing about queer is that the LGBTQIA 2S plus acronym, it does encompass both gender and sexual orientation, but queer sort of takes all of that out and just makes it, I'm not part of the normal attracted to the opposite gender spectrum. I'm outside of that, and I'm outside of the cisgender spectrum. It can be an and or. It can be an either or, but it's inclusive. And it's not about identifying yourself based off of who you are romantically or sexually attracted to. That's another thing that I love about embracing the word queer. Also, it's shorter. And I am all about not shortcuts, but, you know, working smarter, not harder. So the last thing that we'll talk about before just doing a quick discussion on pronouns is the gender non-conforming, non-binary, and genderqueer. So this describes a person who doesn't express their identity or expression on the gender spectrum in ways conforming to societal or cultural norms. So in North American context, that would be man or woman, masculine, feminine. Non-binary people may identify as in between these genders, so somewhere in between the masculine and feminine, as both of them, neither of them, or identify as another gender altogether. So in the Samoan culture that I was talking about earlier, in that culture, there would already be 4 genders. So our context, our Western context of seeing it with only 2 established genders is more limited than some other cultures might have. So a non-binary person in that Samoan culture would fit somewhere that's not in those 4 spots, be somewhere in between those 4 spots, which is more, there are more points on the spectrum, I guess I would say, on that spectrum than there are on ours. So non-binary is something that you might hear more often. I would say that, again, because it's a bit more of a mouthful, you won't hear gender non-conforming as much. Non-binary is more the colloquial term, I would say. And genderqueer, I hear that a lot in, I feel like in British culture, in like British or Aussie or New Zealand, I feel like I hear it more like in the more still like British colony type countries, but I don't hear it as much in a North American context. So these are people who are either searching, they might be searching for where they fit, or they may have just decided that they don't fit on either side of that spectrum and they're somewhere in between, and they love to just live in the in-between. So this little sidebar on pronouns here, I love that it's just made it a little succinct thing on the side. So pronouns are another important way to extend care and hospitality to the LGBTQ to, oh my gosh, LGBTQIA2S+. And this is why we paused. Easier option because we all stumble when we've been talking for a long time. But it's still important to acknowledge that there is a latter part of that word and that you should say it. So some pronouns that people use, so most commonly in our society, you will see she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs, or this one that I had actually not seen before in this toolkit is z, zer, zers, which is trying to take English gender plural out of it. And we've made this point already that someone's gender identity does not always match their gender expression. And if you're unsure and need to know someone's pronouns, just ask, what pronoun do you prefer? Or you can ask, what are your pronouns? Again, if you're offering them first, it's drawing that fish in the sand. It's saying, you're safe here to tell me what your pronouns are. And if someone doesn't offer them after you've offered up yours and drawn that fish in the sand, if they just say, my name's Caitlin, nice to meet you, that's fine. That's okay. And just because you are seeing someone who has a mismatch between what you think their biological sex might be and what their gender expression might be, doesn't mean that you need to push for their pronouns either. They might not feel comfortable sharing their pronouns at a first meeting. They might need some more time to kind of get to know the group. They might not have come to a place where they even feel comfortable saying it out loud. So again, taking the information as it's offered, and the they, them, theirs pronouns, it is difficult in the English language. A lot of things are gendered. We also talked about on our call last week, we talked about how some of the romantic languages, like the language itself is gendered, like nouns have a gender to them. So we're in a beginning stage of how do we incorporate this into these societies where our language is so gendered, because there are some languages where there's very little gender that comes into it, but we are a part of a culture that puts a lot of emphasis on it, and there are languages that also put a lot of emphasis on it. So again, it's something that you have to practice in your brain. Like we all stumble. When you're learning something new, you're never going to be perfect. So all we're asking again is that you take the information as it's offered and try and incorporate it in the most welcoming and affirming way that you can. It is something to practice. It's something that you as an ally are taking on, but it's important work. It's how you can show your respect. And I think, unless you guys think that I've missed anything, I think that kind of wraps up what I had to say. So do you guys have any sort of closing comments or anything else that you would want to add?
I'll just say that last time we kind of ended with a conversation. I don't exactly remember how it got started. And my last time, I mean, when we had this conversation live, but some people were talking about, again, I had mentioned earlier the importance of your words, and by joining this call, especially those of you guys that are watching this, after the fact and putting in the work and the effort to become more inclusive and to understand better, we know that your hearts are in the right place. And so what we're trying to do now through this toolkit and going through this language is to get our words in the right form. One thing I had mentioned is, while I'm starting to understand folks on the call, I'm not a member of the congregation, and so I haven't known people for years, and maybe I don't necessarily know what they mean when they say certain things. I just take their words at face value because I don't know them yet. Whereas Parker and Caitlin maybe take things as, she didn't mean that, this is really what she meant, even though she said that. So we really stress the importance of, that's what this whole process is getting exposure to these words, familiarizing ourselves with them, getting more comfortable. That way, when we're talking to people and, they're coming into your congregation, or whether you're meeting with them outside of the four walls of the congregation, that your words outwardly match what's inside of you. And I think, Caitlin, you had a really good metaphor about a package. I don't want to steal it.
You actually started it. So you said that we're trying, so the conversation we were having was about, different times when people have come to the congregation and the first thing out of their mouth is, my name is this, and here's a piece of information about me that for whatever reason might change your view of me. And for some people, the response was, well, that doesn't matter. Well, I don't care. Coming from a place of what's on your heart is saying that doesn't change the fact that you have value. That's where that message is coming from. And we talked a lot about how specifically in the queer community that would be seen as very dismissive, that it could be seen as aggressive, that it could be seen as unwelcoming and unaffirming. And so what Ashley brought up is we're trying to get our hearts and our words in the same place and kind of make a little package. And so where I went with that was just saying that what we're also trying to do is making sure that like our wrapping paper, what's on the outside of the package matches what's on the inside, and that people are attracted to that wrapping paper, and so that they can see what's on the inside, so that we know how to respond appropriately, so that people want to come back. They want to have more of our package that we have to offer, because we do have so much heart in this congregation.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And I will just say, Caitlin, you might just, I think, be able to stop sharing at this point. I'm not going to reference anything in the toolkit, but I will just say most queer folks have spent the entirety of their lives hiding a portion of who they are, or the better portion of their lives. And I finally came to the realization that what I was really doing was protecting other people from me, from the real me. And so when I have all this pent up stress and anxiety about like, in this context, let's say I'm somebody walking off the street, I want to experience a loving, Christ-centered community. And I walk in, and the first thing after I tell you, because I want to know right out the gate, like, is this okay for me to be who I am? Because if not, like, I'm going to go, because I've already had so much shame and trauma in my life, in a Christian context, especially. If the first thing out of your mouth is, well, what's that matter? To Caitlin's point, it is very dismissive to me, because I am like at the boil over point just by walking into a church. Like, it takes a lot of courage to do that for a queer person. And so the intention, again, is right on. Of course you don't care. Of course you are happy that they are there and that you see them, you fully see them. But it dismisses the experience and the trauma they've had that they just push through to get into your building or to your online session or whatever. And it's difficult, because I think there's a word for this when it comes to like visible minorities, would be you perceive yourself as being colorblind. Well, that's not true. I can tell when someone is not white. I can tell when someone is albino. I can tell when someone is from a certain descent. I can tell when someone has certain characteristics because I have eyes. But to ignore that also ignores their experience, because they move through the world in that body that God created. And so if I ignore that, I'm kind of like assuming that everyone has the same, in my context, I'm assuming everyone is white, male, and privileged. If I'm saying I don't see your color, well, your color probably brought you a lot of hardship in this world, depending on where you grew up and where you lived and what opportunities you were afforded. So I think it's just one of those things we have to really be aware of, to know that, like, if I'm being brave enough to share with you who I am, this part of me, in a church setting specifically, I need you to, I think the way I said it last time on the live call is, I need you to affirm that I just made the right decision. I need to think of it that way. Think of it in terms of, like, you are in the right place. We are so excited that you are here. Our church is like, learn about the church's current stance on queer issues. If you have any questions, contact me. I'd be happy to lead you through them. But our policies on marrying queer couples, queer folks being able to be ordained, Those are opportunities that are not normal in not normal in Christianity. We are in the extreme minority when it comes to Christian experiences as an institution. The fact that I can be ordained is not normal in most institutions, Christian institutions. So don't forget that. Don't take that for granted and just think, oh yeah, we've had that for 8 years. Yeah, we have had the policy change for 8 years, but like we haven't really leaned into it yet. So we're still kind of getting our feet under us and kind of getting our sea legs, if you will, about what this is going to look like. So I know I've said it a million times. I know everybody on this call has said it a million times, but we know your hearts are in the right place. And I know that many of you, if you knew that what you said could have been perceived in the wrong way, you would just be absolutely broken, because you would know, like you want them to feel the love that you have for them. And that's all this is about, is trying to equip you with the right words, the right kind of things to avoid, so that you can ensure that they get that on the other end, the receiving end. I was just going to share screen for 1 second before we close out, if that's okay, because I'm going to send this resource out with this. This is the genderbread person, and it is a visual of everything we just talked about today. And it also kind of like does a very high level, I think it calls it an appetizer for what we just did a deep dive into. So it gives you the visual of a genderbread person. And it also provides these little scales down here. And I love that it's got identity does not equal expression, does not equal sex. We just talked about those 3 things. And gender does not equal sexual orientation. So great reminders. And this is kind of a worksheet, if you will, for your own self to do a check-in and say, where do I fit on this spectrum? Because, you know, I may be straight as an arrow, but I still can recognize when I'm walking through the mall and I see a man that is perceived as attractive. Does that make me attracted to them? No, it means I can recognize what society sees as attractive in men. But what does that say? Like, I'm not blind, you know? So I think it's really good, a good exercise for us to go through. So I'll send this out. You can have your own copy, but I just wanted to give a quick kind of teaser about the fact that that resource does exist. It's on the Harmony page that I created for on the congregation's website. So I'll send that link again as well.
Awesome. And I think that we'll just end on the same note that we ended with the congregation when we had this conversation in person last week, was the amount of gratitude and the amount of respect that I have, and speaking on behalf of all 3 of us, that we have for the congregation to diligently do this work, to be curious, to be open, to be honest. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do it on this forum, but I'm sure that if there's more sharing and more questions and opportunities for that, that any of the 3 of us would be open to that. And the fact that all of our hearts are in the right place and we're just learning how to adjust our packaging and how to best present ourselves in the world and how to really show people what we've got on the inside is so wonderful. And I'm so proud to be part of this community. There's lots of work that we can do. There's always more work to be done. But I think that it's just the improvement day over day, trying to be better tomorrow than we were yesterday, and looking for ways that we can be that truly inclusive, Christ-centered community that we always are striving to be. So thank you all for listening to this. We were hoping to shave it down significantly compared to our congregational chat, but there's so much to talk about, and it leads into so many things and ties back into so many things. So hopefully anybody that's watching this, you found it a useful resource and found it as a good substitute to being here in person. We're sorry that you couldn't join us in person, but we're happy to hopefully have you next week when we meet at our regular time on Wednesday at 6:30. And I'll just open it up to Ashley and Parker if they have any parting comments.
No, I think I'm good. Again, I really appreciate the work that the congregation is doing and that you're doing by putting in the extra time and working this around your schedule to make sure that you stay on track with what we're doing. So I just thank you so much.
I will echo those thoughts and also just say, do not feel panicked if after this very intense hour and whatever bit we've been on here, you're like, okay, I need to let that sit for a little bit. come back to this video, go back to those pages in your toolkit. I'm in the queer community and I slip up all the time. So I need to give that caveat as well. It's all about setting expectations that this is a journey. This is not a destination. We are going to put ourselves in the mindset of knowing that we don't know. And what we don't know, let's do better. Let's learn more about that thing. So here we are on this particular topic for this particular demographic, and we're doing better every single time we meet and discuss and discern. So just because we talked about pronouns on this call and on the previous live call doesn't mean you can't bring up pronouns later, because it might spur something in a later module that you're like, oh, okay, well, how does that work with this now that I've just learned that? That's great. Build upon what we were talking about, and it'll make it so much more realistic and kind of applicable. What is the what's the British version versus the American version? Anyway,
applicable is what the locals would say here.
Okay, I think it's applicable maybe back home. I don't know, whatever. But
No, it's not.
okay, then I'm just crazy, and I'm also from the sticks, so I shouldn't say there because Ashley's the one that's like in the big city in Oklahoma. But all that to say, do your best and bring your questions to us every single time, and if it's from a previous module, that's just fine too. Thank you all so much for watching this.
And thank you, Parker, for recording it and putting it all together.
Yes, I will get this distributed to the whole congregation, because I think the folks who were on the live call might appreciate a kind of review anyway. So
yeah, totally.
Perfect.
All right.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.